Hello, guys, and welcome back to Count to 10. My name is Ani, and today we have a very special live Viva demonstration for you. Now, for those that have watched my previous Viva demonstrations, you know what the typical format is. It's usually 1 minute perusal, followed by 10 minutes of Vivaing with two topics. However, today is a little bit different. Today I'm joined by Nick, who is going to be our candidate. He's currently getting ready to sit his actual Viva. And before we get started, I want to give him a big thank you and a big shout out and wish him all the best of luck in his recent exam. It's always nerve-wracking doing any Viva, let alone a Viva that you know is being recorded and then being published out to the world. So I want to thank him for doing that. And joining me to help out today is our guest examiner, Celia. Celia was in the hot seat not too long ago and did the last Practice Viva demonstration with me, and now she's coming on to be a guest examiner. So I really want to thank her for helping out, and this means that we can do a full Viva station of 20 minutes with 4 topics for you guys. As always, we'll talk about some non-technical feedback at the end and then give the technical feedback. But before we get started, I want to just say thank you to Nick again for this, and thank you for Celia to helping out. So let's dive straight into it.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hello, guys. Thanks for joining me. First of all, thanks, Nick, for doing this. I know it's very nerve-wracking doing this live. How are you feeling?
Yeah, pretty good, mate. Bit nervous, but pretty keen to have another Viva and see how it goes.
Yeah, well, I very much appreciate this. Hopefully, you get some both non-technical skills and technical skills out of it. Celia, thank you also for joining me. How does it feel to be on the other side now, past this exam and being the examiner?
A bit weird and different.
That's totally fine. Look, the further you get away from it, the harder it is to remember what it's like being in the hot seat. But because there's two of us, Nick, the structure is going to be a little bit different compared to what we normally do. So normally it's just me giving a Viva, so we just have 2 topics, 10 minutes. But because there's two of us, we'll have a proper station. So what will happen is that you'll get 1 minute perusal, and Celia will start first, and she'll give you an opening question. In that 1 minute perusal, none of us will be talking. You'll just have time to think. On the real day, you get 2 minutes perusal, but just for the sake of time, we'll just give you 1 minute perusal today. And then you jump right in. You'll get asked some basic questions at the start, like what's your candidate number? Do you understand the question? And then you go straight into the Viva with Celia. She'll cover 2 topics, 5 minutes each, and at 10 minutes, I'll take over and I'll give you 2 topics as well. Now, while Celia's talking and while I'm talking, you might see either of us writing down stuff. Don't worry about that. That's just us doing normal stuff and writing down some notes. And you'll experience that on the day as well, because examiners will write down stuff and they both come up with their grading or their mark, and then they correlate in between stations. So if you see that, don't worry. That's just normal part of everything. And then at the end, we'll give you hopefully some non-technical feedback and some technical feedback, and feel free to ask any questions. Does that sound all good?
Great. Thanks so much.
No worries. Well, if you're ready, we'll get started. Celia, do you have your timer all set up?
Yeah.
Perfect. So then my timer is also set up. We're going to start the 1 minute perusal now. And Celia, you can give Nick the opening question.
Okay. Nick, your opening question is, what is in a bag of packed red blood cells?
Yeah.
That's 1 minute. Candidate, do you understand the question?
Yes.
Okay, can you tell me what is in a bag of packed red blood cells?
Sure. So there's red blood cells that have been distilled. And then there is also sagum. So that's sodium, which is a suspension fluid. There's adenosine, which is a substrate to produce ATP. There's glucose, and then there's mannitol as well.
Is it adenosine?
No, sorry, it's adenine.
Yeah.
Adenine.
Yeah. And how is packed red blood cells kept? And why is it kept the way that it is?
So they're stored in a semi-permeable membrane, and they're stored at 4 degrees Celsius in a fridge, and they're kept at that degree, at that temperature, to avoid things like destruction of the red blood cells, which prolongs their shelf life. If you freeze red blood cells, they can lose their structure, but if red blood cells are kept at room temperature, they're more susceptible to things like infection.
Any other reasons for why it's kept at?
Not that are coming to mind at this point in time.
That's not good. How long can we keep a packed red blood cells?
So you can keep them for 35 to 42 days, and the length of time that you can keep them is determined by the amount of red blood cells that are going to be viable in the patient after 24 hours after transfusion, and it should be above 70%.
Okay, and are there any differences between a fresh packed red blood cell compared to a 35-day-old packed red blood cells?
Sure. So in regards to the hematocrit, it generally remains pretty much the same. In regards to the free hemoglobin, though, you get an increase in free hemoglobin. In regards to the glucose levels, that is going to fall relatively linearly. You'll get an increase in potassium and a reduction in sodium, secondary to dysfunction of the sodium-potassium ATPase. You should get a reduction in 2,3-DPG as well, which after transfusion is going to left shift your oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And then you will get a reduction in factors. So I believe factors 5 and 8, I think, can be found in packed red blood cells, and you will get a deficiency in those, and they will fall precipitously after periods of time. Can't remember the exact periods. They're the changes that are coming straight to mind. There are some others, but I just can't.
You've described biochemical changes. Are there any structural changes that you can expect?
Yeah, so with the structural changes of red blood cells, you'll get increasing cell lysis that occurs over the period of time. And then I'm thinking of platelets in regards to moving from a sphere disc to a sphere shape, but I think the red blood cells swell to some degree and lose their biconcave shape.
And what is the role of a red blood cell?
It's to carry oxygen and deliver oxygen to tissues.
Are there any other roles of a red blood cells?
There are, so it can carry carbon dioxide back from the tissues. It acts as an intracellular buffer for acid-base disturbances, and it allows for we've talked about CO2 carriage. It also produces 2,3-DPG so that you can left or right shift your oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve and change your oxygen carrying capacity.
How does
sorry,
O2 bind to? Yeah.
There you go.
How does O2 bind to red blood cells?
Oxygen binds to the iron moiety of the heme porphyrin ring. So it's, yeah.
And then what kind of metabolism does red blood cell do?
So it is involved in drug metabolism, and so it can, for example, metabolize certain beta blockers like esmolol, and there are esterases within red blood cells that metabolize those drugs. Is that your question?
I guess more I'm saying, is it aerobic metabolism or anaerobic metabolism?
Right. It's only anaerobic metabolism. They lack mitochondria, and so only use glycolysis to produce energy.
Okay. And what's the benefit of having anaerobic metabolism in a red blood cell?
It reduces the size of the red blood cell by reducing the mitochondria, and then it also increases the amount of protein or hemoglobin that can be present in that red blood cell to carry oxygen.
Good. And we're going to move on to the next topic. Where do opioids work at?
The opioids work in different anatomical locations within the central and peripheral nervous system. And so there is supraspinal analgesia, spinal analgesia. There are opioid receptors located on nociceptors and in the periphery. And then there are opioid receptors in other locations throughout the body. But then the types of opioid receptors, there's mu, kappa, and delta opioid receptors, and they're all G protein coupled receptors.
Hey, you mentioned in the spine. Where exactly in the spinal cord do the opioids work at?
Yeah, so the highest density is in the dorsal horn. I believe it's lamina 2 of the substantia gelatinosa in the dorsal horn, and there are pre- and post-synaptic opioid receptors.
Okay, and what happens at the pre- and post-synaptic opioid receptors?
So at the presynaptic opioid receptors, you've got a GIG protein coupled receptor, and opioid binds, and then you reduce your levels of cyclic AMP intracellularly. That reduction leads to a reduction in calcium release from the calcium influx into the cell, and therefore neurotransmitter release from the first to the second order neuron. Postsynaptically, you've got the same structure, so a GIG protein coupled receptor, but it more so inhibits potassium efflux out of the cell and preventing depolarization of that second order neuron. These two things prevent pain transmission.
Okay, and where does it work supraspinally?
Supraspinally, the main mechanism is at the periaqueductal gray, and it binds again to GIG protein coupled receptors, and it impedes, so it inhibits inhibitory neurons, and that leads to reduced inhibition of descending pain modulation pathways that arise from the periaqueductal gray and move down through Lassalle's tract and then modulate spinal analgesia at the level of the spinal cord.
Okay. And does opioid bind to any other sites supraspinally? May or may not have analgesic effects.
Yeah, and so there's like in the prefrontal cortex and the somatosensory cortex as well, and diffusely located in the central nervous system, there are opioid receptors. And so at the chemoreceptor trigger zone, we talked about prefrontal cortex and somatosensory. They're probably the main areas.
Perfect. And what is tolerance?
Tolerance is a repeated dose of a drug will shift log dose response curve to the right. And so repeated doses of that drug mean that an increased dose of the drugs are required to produce the same physiological effect.
Okay, and what are some of the side effects of opioids?
So I'd just use a systems-based approach for this.
Yeah.
From a central nervous system perspective, it can cause euphoria, dependence, tolerance. It can cause centrally mediated, if given intrathecally, itch and also urinary retention, as well as respiratory depression. From a respiratory perspective, you're looking at things like reduction in respiratory rate with maintenance of tidal volume. In patients who are at risk, it can cause obstructions. So that's obstructive sleep apnea patients, obese patients, and neonates. It will also cause a shift in the CO2 and oxygen sensitivities of chemoreceptors. From a cardiovascular perspective, it depends on the opioid that you use, but morphine, for example, can cause histamine release and hypotension, whereas some opioids are considered a bit more stable to the cardiovascular system, like fentanyl, because it doesn't induce that.
Okay. And do we develop tolerance to side effects of opioids?
We do develop tolerance to some of the side effects of opioids. The ones that we don't develop tolerance to are the constipation and the constriction of the ciliary muscle. I forget what that is called at this point in time.
That's all good. And how does tolerance develop?
Tolerance develops generally by a number of mechanisms. So receptor phosphorylation, internalization of receptors, uncoupling of receptors from intracellular second messenger systems. They're the main ones that I can remember.
And I am just going to hand you over to Ani now for his 5As.
Thanks.
All right. Can you tell me what is normal body temperature for an adult?
I'd say normal body temperature is 37 degrees plus or minus 0.2 degrees on either side.
Good. How do you define temperature?
Temperature is the average kinetic energy of molecules within a system.
What's the difference between temperature and heat then?
So heat is the movement of temperature down a gradient, and it's measured in joules, where temperature is measured in either degrees Celsius or Kelvin.
Great. So now if I give you an example of a conscious patient who's been wheeled into the operating theatre where the temperature is 21 degrees, how do they sense the temperature of the external environment?
How does the patient sense the temperature?
Yeah.
So there's bulbs of Krauss and bulbs of Ruffini that are located in different parts of the body. So 20% in the periphery, 20% in the spinal cord, 20% in the central nervous system, 20% in the core, and then I've forgotten where the last 20% are. Those bulbs of Krauss sense that the temperature has been reduced from normal body temperature, and that sensory pathway, well, those sensations are sent to the central nervous system and they're integrated at the hypothalamus.
Okay. So when the bulbs of Krauss recognize this, what nerves are they transmitted along the sensory pathway?
I believe they're A delta fibers that transmit.
Yeah. And you mentioned that it's sensed in the hypothalamus. Do you know where exactly in the hypothalamus it is?
Yes, I do. The supraoptic nuclei and paraventricular nuclei are coming to mind that are the sensors.
And do you know, is this in the posterior hypothalamus, anterior hypothalamus? Which one would be the cold?
Posterior hypothalamus, yeah.
And what's another role of the posterior hypothalamus in regards to temperature?
It's involved in heat gain mechanisms as well, so initiating efferent heat gain mechanism pathways.
Are you sure that's the posterior hypothalamus?
No, yeah, that's the anterior hypothalamus. Oh, sorry, I've got that the other way around.
Sure. Do you know of any other roles that the posterior hypothalamus does?
It's involved in, I believe, cardioacceleratory centers as well. And none other are coming to mind at this point in time.
That's right. It's a minor point. Now, say that the patient is at 21 degrees external temperature. What responses would you expect from this patient while they're awake to maintain their normal temperature?
Yeah, so behavioral responses, vasoconstriction, which are autonomic responses, and then shivering, depending on what their external temperature is, so 21 degrees Celsius, and then non-shivering thermogenesis is generally for younger neonates.
What are the goals of these responses that you mentioned?
The goal is to maintain core body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius.
Okay, but how is it actually doing that?
So behavioral changes might be putting a blanket on, reducing your body surface area. Vasoconstrictive properties might be shunting blood away from the periphery or the skin and maintaining it in the core so that there's less heat that can be transferred to the environment. And then shivering can be voluntary or involuntary with different frequencies. And the point is to increase your metabolic rate, increase heat production.
Okay. Now, say if I take that same patient and I increase the ambient temperature of that operating theatre to say 27 degrees, would you still expect those responses to occur?
So the thermoneutral zone for an adult patient that's closed is 27 degrees. It's within 27 degrees. Yeah. And so if the patient is closed, then I would expect that they would probably not have any responses apart from vasoconstriction to regulate their core body temperature.
Yeah, you mentioned the thermoneutral zone. What is that?
The thermoneutral zone is the range of ambient temperatures within which only autonomic regulatory processes will maintain the core body temperature. And so that's like vasoconstriction and vasodilation.
Sure. What if I change my patient now from a healthy adult to a neonate? Would they still have compensatory mechanisms with their OT temperature of 27 degrees?
I would expect that they would. The thermoneutral zone for a neonate is much higher. And so for a term neonate, I'm thinking of about 31 to 32 or 33 degrees Celsius. Sure. And their mechanisms are different. So yes.
Yeah. We're going to change topic now. Can you tell me or describe some of the ways that blood pressure can be measured?
Sure. It can be measured invasively or non-invasively. And non-invasive methods would be oscillatory methods. So you could use the Korkoff sounds. You could use a dynamap, which is that's an oscillatory method. And then you can use invasive methods, and so intra-arterial lines and aortic lines near the aorta as well.
Sure. So say you're setting up an arterial line system.
Mm.
What would you need to set it up?
So a cannula that's generally short, wide bore. I'd need a tubing set that is generally quite non-compliant. I'd need a pressure bag and a bag of likely saline, well, definitely saline. And then I would need all of that to be attachable to a pressure transducer, and then that pressure transducer to be attached to a central processing unit and a monitor.
Okay, so say you've successfully put an arterial line and you connect that system that you've described, and you notice in that tubing that there's a massive air bubble in your fluid line. How would this impact your blood pressure reading?
It would cause a distortion of the blood pressure reading, and you probably get a higher systolic and a lower diastolic.
Why would you? What do you think is occurring when there's an air bubble?
So you've got underdamping of the system, and so what that is you've got a frequency which is being applied to the system, which is the arterial waveform. Then you've got an air bubble that is a compressible piece of it's a compressible medium that the pressure tubing that the pressure waveform can move within. That's being transmitted to a pressure transducer, and through that transmission you're getting wider fluctuations within the systolic and diastolic pressure.
Sure. You mentioned the term damping. Can you define damping?
Damping is the resistance of oscillations in a system due to frictional forces, or the dissipation of those oscillations within a system due to frictional forces.
So do you think an air bubble is enhancing frictional forces or decreasing frictional forces?
I actually think it's decreasing frictional forces in the air bubble.
So you mentioned that you would think that it was underdamped. Are you sure about that?
No, I think it would be overdamped, and it would actually do the opposite to the waveform.
And so what would you see on your waveform then?
A lower systolic, a higher diastolic, a waveform that's generally not well defined.
Yeah, good. And so how do we normally measure the systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, and the mean arterial pressure on the invasive arterial line?
The systolic blood pressure is the peak, the diastolic blood pressure is the runoff, and then the mean arterial pressure, I believe, is a component of the area under the curve.
Yeah, good. Now, you mentioned damping as a source of error. Do you know of any other sources of error with arterial line?
So I'd just break it into equipment, patient, and then monitoring errors. And so equipment errors can be things like the arterial system. It's like the system itself is highly compliant. The pressure, the bag, the pressure bag, the bag is not under adequate pressure and can lead to things like thrombus within the arterial line. Patient issues could be things like a vascular path patient who's difficult to cannulate, hypercoagulable states that lead to clots in the line. And then monitoring errors could be things like disconnection of the monitor, the Wheatstone bridge or strain gauge is defective or damaged. Yeah.
What do we talk about when we talk about static errors?
Oh, right. You can break it into static and dynamic errors. And so I believe static errors has to do with your ability to zero. So the system needs to be zeroed, and atmospheric pressure needs to be eliminated from the measurement within the system. And then dynamic errors are some of the ones that I've talked about.
Yeah, so you mentioned dampening. What is another dynamic error? That's right. Can you tell me what resonance is?
Yeah, resonance is when a frequency is applied to a system that is of a similar
We'll
frequency
stop
to its
there, Nick.
natural.
That's time.
Thanks, Arnie.
No worries. How do you take a moment and then tell us how you feel?
I felt all right with the first three, and then I just, with arterial lines, it's something that no matter how often I go over it, it just doesn't stick there in a way that to me is logical to talk it out.
That is totally fine. Celia and I were having a chat before you jumped on about the exact same feeling with arterial lines.
Yeah.
I got an arterial line question in my vibe, and although you feel like you know it really well, it's like one of those things when like someone really breaks down the knowledge and you don't have the capability to write down stuff as you're going along. It's really hard. But take a step back. In terms of your first three vibes, why do you feel those went really like you felt comfortable there? Not the technical stuff, but how did you feel?
I felt as though when I was being asked a question, I was answering the question, and I was going back to, I think like you have flashbacks of either like studying in your study group and you're talking through these concepts and you're really distilling these things into something that can fit in your head, and then you can bring it out and show it to someone when they ask you in a Viva situation. And I felt with those questions that I've done this enough times. I've distilled this into a package that works for me, and I can answer the question that's in front of me. And then I compare that to the last one, and the questions are the same, but it's just not probably in my head in these neat little packages that I can just pick up and be deliver to someone and say, this is what I understand about it.
Well, I think that shows that you have really good critical feedback of yourself. And my overall impression is that you did really well. And
Thanks.
I think Celia and I will both say that you're probably past this 20-minute station quite easily and comfortably. And whether you get a pass mark on the last, about arterial lines, maybe it's a borderline, but like overall, the main thing I wrote down when you were going through Celia's vibes straight away was a very calm structure, and you kept that calmness throughout. And I think that from a non-technical perspective really helped you, because when Celia asked some probing questions about things that weren't answered, that calmness made sure that you didn't go too high, too low. You stayed very even keel, and it meant that your explanations were very logical to answer. Kind of when I was listening to you, I was kind of like, not in a bad way, I was just drifting and daydreaming because I'm like, this guy's just answering the question. And so I don't really have to worry about writing down lots of notes, which I didn't write down lots of notes. Now, in saying that, sometimes what can happen from a non-technical perspective is that people can get really worried if they don't get a question, they don't hear a question in the right way. And they go on a train of thought and they can't pull themselves back. And I think this happened when Celia might have asked you a question about metabolism and red blood cells.
Yeah.
And as you were saying it, you probably thought it was not going down the right track, but you did something that was really good, and I recommend people to do more often, which is ask for clarification from the examiner if that is what they wanted. And that's a really good trick, but also shows that you're confident and like, I'm not just stressed and like saying things you're not meant to be saying. Because when you get stressed, you can say lots of things and you don't remember what you've said. And then that's the worst thing. If you don't remember what you've said, you're like, did I mention that before? It's really hard to pull yourself back. So I think your overall rate of speech, your general demeanor throughout was really good. And it really showed when you did your opening statement for your second question, which you could just break down into, you had these boxes in your head of like opioids. And I could just see you breaking down these boxes and being like, I'm answering the question, but I'm giving you a second answer. I'm giving you a third answer. So where do you want to go? It was like, you could see that your confidence level with opioids was very high. Maybe you've had it a few times, or you're just comfortable with that topic. And it didn't seem like you got bogged down too long in any question that you didn't understand. You're like, I know this is something, but I can't remember at the moment. And you just kind of let Celia then take you on. So those were my non-technical feedback for you. And overall, I thought that was a very impressive 20 minutes of vibing that you did, and a really high standard. So I'll hand you over to Celia and see what she has to say about more of the technical aspects of the first two vibers.
Thanks, Arnie.
But I'm going through the technical stuff now.
Yeah, or you can put some non-technical
Um,
things as well, because from your perspective, you might have got
I
a different
yeah,
different gist of how Nick was doing.
no, I agree with everything Ani said. Like you weren't flustered. You got probed when I was like, what about this? And you weren't sure. You're like, that's all I can think of. And then you moved me along quite quickly, I guess. Um, for technical stuff, your puck for blood cells, you got essentially all the answers that I have written down. Um, the other questions afterwards would just be about transfusion and like ABO antigens and stuff.
Yeah.
But I think you guys covered that on your written for plasma transfusion. So I think you would hopefully understand that pretty well, like transfusion stuff. But structural changes, which I probed you, was they become more spherical than biconcave shape.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then the role of the red blood cell, I think you just need a bit more probing as to like other stuff other than transport O2. So it's just important to remember that there's other stuff, even though you might think B5 is going down one route.
Yeah.
And then the opioid one, you were really confident that because it seems like you had like Ani said, you had structures to answer that opening question. And you basically went over quite a bit in your opening statement for the first questions, which made me kind of skip around some of the questions I've had down because you've already covered it. So you moved along that pretty well. Yeah, I don't know. Overall, like you've got all the answers to the questions I've had, and yeah, you were good at remaining calm and you weren't flustered at all, which is impressive because I was flustered when I was asked these questions.
I was internally flustered, don't worry.
No, but it's because you didn't show it to like some of the exam. I had an examiner that just stared at me the entire time, like just didn't really blink while another examiner was asking me questions. And I was just completely flustered just with the way that she was looking at me, and she wasn't even asking me questions. So it's good to have that composure and being able to maintain calm on the outside.
Yeah. Thanks, Celia. I really appreciate it.
All right, Celia, what do
yeah.
you think from when Nick was doing my vibers in terms of the non-technical aspects? Anything different when you were the one observing rather than asking the questions?
I think it was good. Like I think the same things as what I observed when I was asking the question, and I think when Ani went back to kind of correct guide you to the right answer from before, you weren't flustered and you were like, yeah, like you weren't there arguing with the examiner, which I think I've heard people do kind of disagree with exams on the day of, but you didn't, and you're like, yeah, um, and I think that was good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think arguing with examiners is a big point. And actually, I think I gave you a wrong answer as well, which might have been bad because when we talked about the first vibe, talking about the posterior hypothalamus, you said it also does heat gain responses, which in my head I have interpreted as heat loss responses, thinking it was the warm response. So you were right with that. It was posterior
Yeah.
hypothalamus does the cold responses, which would then be for heat gain. So I asked you, like, are you sure about that? And you're like, oh, I'm not sure. And it was just me. So, sometimes everyone's human, will also make mistakes. And so
Yeah.
I remember, like, in my actual vibers, they mentioned something about, like, which way does the oxygen dissociation curve shift in, like, altitude? And I'm like, no, I know that this is from nuns, it shifts this way. And the examiner was like, no, it doesn't. And I'm like, okay. Like, and you just have to kind of go with it. And you're like, oh, well, I read the recommended textbook. And so, and then you're like, okay, just leave that point, move on. And you did, and that was important. I think before we break down these two vibers, another thing that I would mention is that when you have so much knowledge, and you could say that you could see that, like with simple questions that Celia was asking about, like how does this work, and you're like, GI protein coupled receptor works through, like, cyclic AMP. Sometimes just peel back that knowledge because it can absorb a little bit of time. Like, so your opioid opening statement, while we really said it was awesome, you covered lots of things and you categorized, it was 30 seconds of your time. And from examiners, that opening question is just to get you comfortable.
Yeah.
So, and the good thing in that perspective was that as Celia was saying, like that helped, like you covered a lot of things that she was going to ask. But sometimes if it's not going to be part of things that you're going to ask, then you might be just losing time.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would also recommend is that categorization is really key. So again, with that question about, what are the different things that happen with blood at 35 days, you went straight into the biochemical, I believe, and then
Yeah.
Celia asked you the structural. So if you just went into categorization without delving in and then said, is there one that you would like me to focus on? And if Celia said, oh no, can you just tell me a bit about all of them? Or yeah, can you tell me about, this? Then that would have just saved you a little bit of extra time.
Yeah.
So just think about that, because you had a good systems-based approach for when Celia asked you about the side effects of opioids, you went, oh, I think about this in a system-based approach.
Yeah.
And so then the examiner goes, oh, well, even if they don't get that right, well, at least they've already told me what their approach is. So I can then ask about that information, but I can't ask you something that you haven't mentioned.
Yeah.
So just when you know something really well, just peel it back a little bit, because you know that if they ask me, I can go on this.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Arnie. That's great feedback, man. Appreciate it.
So then when we talked about temperature, like this wasn't a particularly hard vibe. It was just asked in the way that I didn't want to ask you the classical questions of just define. We did that at the start when we talked about, can you define temperature and heat? Because that's an important distinction to understand, what determines which way heat gets transferred and the difference between heat and temperature. But then thinking about it in like a clinical context of a patient at 21 degrees makes you just think about it in a different way. So it's like if I just said, what are the sensory pathways, you could just rattle them off. But just giving you the clinical context and then saying, okay, well, this person's at 21 degrees, what responses would you occur? You have to then understand the fact, interpret, and then go, okay, this is below my thermoneutral zone. This would cause, behavioral vasoconstriction, non-shivering thermogenesis, shivering, all those things. So it's just asked in a way that was just slightly different. But you could see throughout, you understood why I was asking this, and you mentioned the key points, like you mentioned the buzzwords in your answer, which I think was really nice. Like you mentioned thermoneutral zone, and then I just make sure you knew that definition, so I just clarify and be like, can you define that? So I wasn't going to ask you what that word was, but if you mention it, then I would ask you what it is. And if you didn't mention it, I would be like, oh, so what is this like? What is this? Why does this happen? And hopefully you'd get probed to mentioning it.
Yeah.
The other role of the hypothalamus posterior specifically is setting the interthreshold range. And
Yes.
so while it was a minor point, if you mention it, then I would ask you that definition. So I was hoping that you would offer that up, but we would get to it later on anyway, because then this vibe is meant to go for much longer. Doesn't mean that you have to get to the end. But once we get through to the last question of the neonate and what compensatory mechanisms that they have, and you said appropriately, it's outside the thermoneutral zone. And you could just finish there, when you said that answer, you could say, this is outside the neonate's thermoneutral zone, which is normally 32 to 34 degrees. And their main, if I wanted to, I would ask you, what's their main mechanism? And you could say non-shivering thermogenesis. But that might not be where I'm going. It's just to be like, hey, you know that the thermoneutral zone is different. That's all I wanted to understand. Because then we could go back into the patient and then talk about, well, now you've given them a GA and it's been 30 minutes later, and you've got to put a blanket on, and you've got to put a warmer on. What do you think their temperature is? And then you would go, oh, yeah, they've hopefully gone through phase 1 redistribution, so their temperature decreases by 1.5 or 2 degrees. And I go, why do you say that? And you say, oh, well, the interthreshold range is increased during a GA. And so then I'd ask you what the interthreshold range is. So I didn't want to ask you directly. I wanted you to kind of connect the dots yourself.
Yeah.
Which is sometimes they do that, because then this is just another way for them to make sure that you're understanding, rather than ask you like straight up definitions, which you might get in a Viva quite commonly.
Awesome. Thanks, Arnie. Yeah, that's a good way to structure that.
And then the second one, arterial line, the one that gives us all lots of like anxiety. The main crux of it is just to see whether you can understand the relationship when we get further down into what is the relationship between damping and natural frequency and resonance. So resonance is the increase of amplitude of the wave as it approaches its natural frequency. Natural frequency is the frequency at which a wave will freely oscillate without any further energy. damping is essentially the loss of energy with each oscillation. So you have the classic analogy of a bouncing ball. You leave the ball bouncing, and with each energy, the bounce becomes less and less. If it's overdamped, it becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. If it's underdamped, the bounce will go higher and higher and higher. Somewhere in between is optimal damping. Now, if you make a system too damped, it decreases the natural frequency of that system, which means the resonance is getting closer to the natural frequency. So all arterial systems have a really high natural frequency, so they don't have the same natural frequency as our heart rate and our blood pressure, to avoid it being close to natural frequency, because then it'll lead to, overestimation of systolic blood pressure and underestimation of diastolic blood pressure. So the correlation I wanted to get to eventually was that if you do things to our arterial line system setup, like make the tubing too long, that will lead to too much damping, but also decrease the natural frequency. So there's this balance. If you overdamp the system, you decrease the natural frequency. You don't want it too close to our normal natural frequency, because then it will freely oscillate. If you underdamp the system, the natural frequency will be higher. So there's this balance between resonance and damping, which is really hard to understand. And I had to read like 4 or 5 different articles on derange to try to get this understanding. And I don't expect you to get to that. Like, I know exactly what each one of these variables does, and I know the natural frequency equation. I just wanted to get to the understanding of like, there is a relationship between dampening and resonance, and therefore natural frequency. You might not know exactly what that relationship is, but you understand that there's a relationship. So that's what this Viva is built for. And this Viva goes into some hardcore things pretty quickly. Like, if there's no like warming up, it's like, hey, there's an air bubble. What do you think is happening? It's not like, hey, can you define damping? Can you define resonance? And on the day when I got a Viva, it was about both non-invasive and invasive blood pressure monitoring, they kind of just went straight into it. They showed me like a fast flush test within like the first 3 minutes. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like, I thought this was like a very peripheral thing, but you're going to show me a photo of that. So sometimes you'll get Viva, which is like, it's straight into it, because like they really want to see like where you're sitting in terms of your knowledge base and have you understood this. And it doesn't make you a better anesthetist or a worse anesthetist. It's just like really just seeing like, have you spent a lot of time? And you can't spend a lot of time with every topic. So there's just some things that you'll have to be like, sorry, this is not a topic that's my best. And in that's totally fine, because you just have to live with that, and because you can't know everything about everything.
Yeah, it's frustrating. I find art lines like perpetually frustrating. You go through and you do a deep dive and you forget some components. And then, I think when people ask you the questions on it, there's multiple definitions, and it's not something I've ever felt strong with. So definitely going to be reviewing that.
Yeah,
so I'm glad I got it today and didn't stumble on it on the day.
No, you did very well, Nick. Like, overall, we're giving you pretty hardcore critical feedback, but it's only because we think you did really well, and you kind of smashed it out of the park. I wouldn't really worry about the last Viva. Even then, you still got like the basic stuff. Like, you still got the core things about knowing what components you need in the setup, which is like the important thing, right? Like that'd be a safety thing, or like the basic mark. Like, do you know what components and why they're needed? Then we can talk about categorization and the sources of error. And that's again, it's high level, but not everything you need to know to that high level. So I think overall my impression was that you smashed it. You were very calm. You had a good pace. You had a good rate of speech. And you didn't show that on the surface if you were feeling anxious, which like this is as close I think you could replicate to the actual day. I don't know, Celia, when you did this last time, did this feel like what it was, or was it even higher level of stress on the day?
It's a different kind of anxiety and nervousness, I think. This is because it's published out there for people to see, like your bosses and your colleagues, and it's just a different kind of like stress. But it was nice to kind of do this last year, to just deal with another uncomfortableness, and learning just how to deal with that, I think, was the reason why I did it.
Nick, do you have any questions before we let you go?
No, I don't think so. Like, I'm definitely going to be reviewing some of that stuff that you guys pointed out, but I yeah, I can't thank you both enough again. Like it's, you know, the amount of, and probably everybody, the amount of effort that you consultants and fellow like peers put into vivering you and teaching you during this period is pretty, it's really nice. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time to vive me. It helps immeasurably.
Well, thanks for your kind words. Thank you again for volunteering. Thank you, Celia, for being a guest examiner. I appreciate it. You guys were both amazing, and I wish you the best of luck in your vivas coming up. So I'll catch you guys next time, hey?
Thanks, mate. Bye.